check out on this, and as described, I'll be talking about some climate science, starting with the basics. I'll be talking about the science parts, not the policy implications thereof, because that's what my job is, to deal with science. Just happens to be science that is socially relevant. And with that, I will be focusing a lot on the use of climate models and how they play a role in developing our knowledge base, as well as how they are then used for decision support purposes. Okay, so I would say that for several decades in the science realm, and since the late 1980s in perhaps some segments of the public realm, there's been three large-scale climate science questions that have been posed. First one is that whether or not the planet's climate is changing in significant ways, and we would call that a matter of detection. We're going to be looking backwards, and one will rely primarily on observations in order to do that, to see how things are changing. Now, if it turns out that there is a significant change, then the next question that could follow is, do we know why? There's multiple potential reasons for it. There could be some things that people are doing. There could be natural reasons or a combination of both. So that's something we would call an attribution process. Once you detected something, can you say why? Maybe the answer is yes, maybe no. And that's something that we will rely on both observations and computer models in order to perform a series of experiments to see if we can explain and come up with a physics-based, physically consistent way that explains how things are happening. And then, if we want to, we can then ask the question about how might the Earth's climate change in the coming decades or century or so. And that's something that we have no observations of the future, so we need to rely on climate models in order to give us an idea within the context of a what-if scenario. What if people do this? How might the climate respond? So, with those as the major three questions, I can say that in recent decades, there have been some major advancements in climate science, and the way we, as a field, as a scientific community, have increased our level of confidence in our understanding about those three questions is a combination. It comes not from just one source of information, but broadly speaking, we refer to the sturdiness of a three-legged stool. Part of it comes from an analysis of observations. We want to see what's going on, and as more observations come to bear and more analysis, we learn more about what has happened in the past. We also end up with refinements of what I can call our scientific understanding or our theories. We develop a better understanding about how the different parts of the world's climate system are connected. The atmosphere, ocean, sea ice, land surface, all that. And then finally, the third part of the sturdy three-legged stool has to do with the results of computer modeling. And when these three come together, as they have, and there's more and more agreement and a better understanding about the way the parts work, they revealed a clear and consistent set of messages. Now, those messages come through clearest when we start looking at large spatial scales. So we're going to have more confidence if we talk about how the planet's average might change, or how we can expect the Arctic to warm perhaps twice as quickly as equatorial regions as we move through the 21st century. We can say more and have more confidence at that large scale than we might at being able to say how changes in Houston are going to be different than ones in New Orleans. And we also tend to, at first, will have more confidence at the multi-decadal timescales, looking out 50 or so years, where then we can say the signal of human-induced climate change emerges from the background variability that will continue due to natural occurrences. So if you're looking for a signal, there's a certain amount of noise in the background, and that can emerge. So there's certain time scales and certain spatial scales where we will have some more confidence than in others. So returning to the three questions, the answers that have built up over the past few decades and are now quite compelling. Answer to question number one, is the planet's climate changing in significant ways? Answer is yes. It's more or less unequivocal. And we're not just talking about surface air temperatures, but we're talking about a whole host of indicators that are physically consistent, including a big one being the warming of the ocean, three-dimensionally, as well as the atmosphere and several related indicators. Second part, the question of, well, even if we've detected, can we say what's causing it? And it's going to be a mix of naturally occurring variability and human-induced changes, but the conclusions that are also about in the literature at a high level of confidence is that most of the warming that has been seen by the planet in the last half-century can be directly attributed to human activity. Or another way to put it is that we cannot explain what has been observed over the past 50 or so years on the planetary scale in terms of increasing temperature by having occurred by natural forces alone, that there is a human impact, and that actually is one of the dominant features. So then looking ahead to then the question of how might things change in the future, that's what we're going to use climate models for, and there's going to be uncertainties associated with that. But in general, the envelope of possibilities as we look forward all show us that the changes are quite likely to continue, and perhaps at a greater rate in the 21st century than what was seen during the 20th. So that's kind of the starting point. We have solid science. It's not a house of cards. There are multiple lines of evidence that are all coming together in a consistent manner based upon observations, theories, and models. We start again, as I said, at the larger scale, on the multi-decadal time scales. But what we see is that these points, as they come across, are quite compelling, and they can cause a large number of people to then put climate change on their own personal radar. I mean, okay, I'm going to pay attention to this. Now, what does it mean for me? And when people ask what it means for them, they often are talking about what it means for them in their backyard. So by asking that, often the typical question that comes back deals with the smaller spatial scale and often shorter time scales than where the greatest confidence is. And so then we need to dig a little deeper into say what our level of confidence or what information can be conveyed from the science realm over to folks who are interested in using the best available information in order to inform their decisions. So this is a schematic that just kind of outlines one way you can view as to how this transfer and translation of climate information can go from, in the upper left-hand corner, you see the elements of our sturdy three-legged stool, where we gain information in the science realm from observations, our understanding in the models, but then before it's something that's going to be useful for helping to aid decisions, we often have to go through a step of kind of translating it and maybe scaling it down to the level that where then it's in a form that is usable for what we can call climate impacts analyses. And there's a really wide range of climate impacts analyses. We can think about how climate can affect agriculture or human health or marine resources or sea level or national security. There's many quite serious folks who are asking serious questions of the science about what information we might have that they can consider. And then, so we can consider those climate impacts analyses, and then that information in turn needs to be communicated to folks who are making decisions. They can be in the private sector, public sector, or individuals, and then they in turn, their questions feed back into the science realm in terms of some of the issues that we put more focus on. So that's a schematic of how the science goes about. Now, the question about what the science might have to offer depends upon the type of question people have as they look forward and have questions about climate change. Broadly speaking, we can divide the questions into two categories. There are people who are interested primarily in climate change mitigation, and by mitigation we mean they're wondering about potential human interventions that could reduce the amount of change that will come in the future, and that would involve primarily reducing the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So that's a mitigation focus. But there's also a growing interest in climate change adaptation. There's a certain amount of climate change that's already happened. There's more that's already in the cards. So then what kind of interventions might be taken seeking to reduce the vulnerability of things that you care about, whether they're part of nature or part of human systems? What can be done to perhaps make it more resilient or less vulnerable to climate change effects? So those are different topics, and just as a baseline, if you hear people talking about whether or not it's worthwhile to increase fuel efficiency standards or talk about cap and trade bills or geoengineering, those are things that would fit on the mitigation side, just seeking to reduce the amount of climate change that might happen in the future. But if there's questions about whether you want to have new flood control projects or build reservoirs to deal with changing water resources or raise seawalls, or if the Navy's now thinking about perhaps building more ships to patrol the Arctic, which might be something they do more of when the Arctic sea ice is reduced, those are aspects of adapting to a changing climate. So if we think about going from the best available climate science over to translating it so people are comfortable converting it into some actions, there are very different views about what the science might have to offer. And I show here a little picture you might recognize from Washington, D.C. Not that I spend much time there, but we do get feedback from folks in the policy-making realm, and as it happened a few years ago, I heard some very different views about what was going to be asked of climate change science that I want to share with you here. So there was someone, a high-ranking Senate staffer working for Sherwood Boehlert, who is a Republican congressman from upstate New York, who told me in a group I was in that by 2007, in his view, the climate science was essentially done. That the major questions, those three that I pointed out earlier on, had been asked, and they were the policy relevant ones, and they'd been answered at a sufficient level that now the ball was essentially in the court of the policymakers to do with as they will. There wasn't a whole lot more beyond the idea that it should be on their radar screens because the climate was changing, most of it due to human activity, and there's more in the future. So there really wasn't much more to add to that. Now, however, at about the same time, I talked to another staffer who told me, she said, you know, I don't think that you climate scientists really realize what you've done. By answering those very same three questions, you've now created a demand for information, not at the large scale, but people want to know how it's going to affect them again in their backyard. But is the science able to answer those kinds of questions? And so whether the science was done or the science was completely lacking, one could have a different view about whether you're more interested in the mitigation question or the adaptation question. So with that now as background, I'll just go into the idea of when I've already mentioned the idea of having models of the global climate system. What do I mean by global climate modeling? So I'll give a brief primer on that. And here you can see a slide that very cartoonish, very simplified, will maybe give you an idea about the idea that we have to consider a large number of elements when one considers the global climate system. It's not just thinking about what's happening near the surface in terms of temperature and precipitation. We need to think about the atmosphere, the ocean, sea ice, and land surface. And we're not just thinking about the natural variations, but we need to think about what people are doing to changing the flow of energy, moisture, and other things that are of importance through the different parts of that climate system, how that can be altered. And really, as time goes on, we focus not just on the basic physical science of it, but increasingly there's more chemistry, more biology in what we need to consider, because we need to think about the carbon cycle as well. So you can see elements there about the biosphere and plants and both on the ocean and the atmosphere. So it's a complex system with a bunch of parts, and we need to come up with mathematical representations of those various parts so that we can simulate how they interact with one another and how they might respond to when changes in one thing, how it affects others in the system as well. So we get back to the question of just how can one perform experiments on the global climate system. When I give talks in middle schools or high schools, one of the slides I like to show is this one, where I say, well, we can't just take the Earth, shrink it down, and perform experiments in it. We don't have a twin planet Earth that we can change the amount of carbon dioxide, stick it in a time machine, and see how it responds. So how does one go about asking and posing these questions in a scientific manner? And the answer is that instead of having a physical model of the Earth, what we do is we take what we know about the planet and the different parts of the climate system, we convert that knowledge into computer code based upon the fundamental physics, conservation of energy, momentum, gravity, all those good things, F equals ma, and represent those in a way where we divide the planet up into millions of boxes, and then our laboratory ends up being large computers, supercomputers, so that when we can create mathematical models and examine if we change one element, how does our simulation respond? And we can do that for the past, the present, and the future. The better that our models represent the past, the more confidence we can have in the way they go to the future. So we can think of the climate models as virtual Earths. They provide us a method to estimate how the planet can respond to changes in not just greenhouse gases, but other climate-forcing agents, including a lot of ones that are natural. Changes in volcanic aerosols, changes in the output from the sun, all those things are going to be considered. And in the traditional model, we'll think about the atmosphere, the ocean, the sea ice, and the land physics and how they're interacting, as I mentioned before. But increasingly, we're going to think about how the carbon cycle and other elements fit together as well. So the models, now we sometimes, instead of referring them to climate models, you might hear the phrase Earth system model. That tends to indicate or signal that there's elements of biology and chemistry in there increasingly as well, so the models become more sophisticated, contain more parts. So I mentioned before that we divide the planet up into a lot of grid boxes, and that's something that's going to be related directly to the amount of computer power available. So when I first got into this field in the 1980s, this is the grid that was used in the world's best global climate model. I hope you can make out there's North America in the upper quadrant, and then in the lower right you can see South America, with the green being land and the bluish boxes being ocean, and each box on the kind of checkerboard pattern representing a grid cell in the horizontal space. So in other words, there would be one value at a given time for each of those boxes. So it's a fairly coarse resolution view, but if we look at how that has changed over time, just because of the fact that computers are getting more powerful, in our current models we can divide the grid, so that's what the checkerboard pattern looks like, which will probably be very difficult for you to see. It is for me. So how about I zoom in on an area of the Gulf of Mexico, and by 2009 our workhorse model had a grid that looked like this. Again, you might want to have finer, smaller grid boxes than that, but we're having a better, more high-resolution view of things, and that can be more physically consistent than we had back in the past. So as computer power increases, we can end up with a more refined view of how the global climate system can be represented. So that's what it looks like in one of our current workhorse models, just by comparison, that same geographic area back in that 1980s model. I think you'd have a hard time figuring out if I just showed you that we were even looking at the Gulf of Mexico. And all that has to do with the computer power. Now, the computer power allows us to go from different resolutions, and we definitely see a more physically realistic simulation as one makes those grid boxes smaller. Here we're seeing the comparison between not 1980s and more recent models, but just between one generation. The image on the left shows sea surface temperatures as simulated in the model with a 1 degree latitude-longitude grid, so maybe about 60 miles across on the side of those grid boxes, and you see a smooth pattern. If you step back far enough, it's going to look very similar to the one on the right, but you can see that extra detail, what we would call the eddies, or the finer scale details that emerge. We get a more realistic representation of the physics by being able to have those smaller grid boxes, and those smaller scale features can matter. They help transport heat, nutrients, and other properties from one place to another. So we can do a better job of representing the details of the climate system. And one thing that we have seen is, at least in terms of the large-scale conclusions that we have had over the years, there's been no major overturning of results yet when going from one resolution to the next. Pretty much the older results have held up, and we're just putting a little bit of a finer point on it thus far. We'll see about the next generation models. So far I've focused a little bit on the horizontal spatial resolution. Here's an image just to remind me to tell you that these models are three-dimensional, so we have to divide the planet up into a large number of boxes in the vertical as well. Perhaps you can recognize this as an area where I just zoomed in on part of that global model for an area of the East Coast. So here's Cape Cod, Long Island, New York, New Jersey, DC, divide the atmosphere up into about three dozen vertical levels, and the ocean into 50 or so vertical levels. So that's what's needed in order to, we feel, in order to come up with a good modern representation of the three-dimensional physics of the climate system, so that we can represent it and perform some of those what-if tests. And it can do a decent job of reproducing the past, and then we can use it to test things in the future. So to summarize, the climate models, the main goals you could think of as simulating the flow of energy, heat, one form of energy, momentum, water, and a bunch of other features of interest through the various part of the planet's climate system, and by that we can think primarily the atmosphere, ocean, land, and ice. And the models are also time dependent. In other words, they march forward in time. It's not as if we just say, okay, let's solve this like you might with a spreadsheet, where say, okay, let's change some things, hit return, and now we'll instantly get an answer of what it's going to look like in the year 2050. Instead, much like weather models, the climate models are marching through in time, where they're taking time steps, and from one time step to the next could be just a matter of minutes or an hour or so, and the whole time evolving system is being simulated. Now, a way to think about this that I found, and for some folks helps out, is that, you know, I've described out how we divide the planet up into a bunch of grid boxes. So in that high resolution model I just showed you, the three-dimensional planet is being divided up into a total of about 70 million grid points. So if you think about a Rubik's Cube, there's 27 grid cells, you know, boxes contained in that one cube, 3 times 3 times 3, 27. So if you wanted to represent our global climate model as a series of Rubik's Cubes, you would need 2.5 million Rubik's Cubes just to have the same number of grid cells. So that's one way to think about the large number of grid boxes that we divide the planet into. And now at each of those grid boxes, what do? Well, there's a lot of physics that's being represented. We take what's known about the planet's climate system, the basic underlying physics, and then we have to convert that knowledge into a series of equations, and they're going to be solved at each one of those grid boxes, and each one of those grid boxes is going to communicate with its neighbors. So it's a lot of equations, and that's one of the reasons we need, and you end up using some of the more higher powered computers in the world in order to solve these problems, much as the same way that they're used for weather forecasts. So we take the model, and now just to illustrate it, let's think about those equations, and instead of focusing on 70 million grid points, let's think about just one. A single model grid cell, and let's assume it's in the atmosphere, not the ocean for this case, and let's assume that it's one that's sitting above me here in Princeton, New Jersey, and it happens to be on a particular day. And also let's assume that right now at our starting point the temperature is about 10 degrees centigrade or 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you want to get an idea about what is involved in terms of computations in order to figure out what the temperature will be like at the next time step, to figure out if that grid box happens to be warming or cooling, I'll kind of schematically walk through that now. What if we had our question of what's it going to be like 10 minutes later? So what kind of things in the physical climate system can cause that box, the air in a given place, to warm or cool? One has to do with sunlight, or what we would call solar radiation. You want to know how much is being absorbed, because if you absorb solar radiation, it's going to get warmer. Now, one thing that we have in the model that we actually specify, that we hardwire, is we say, okay, this is how much energy is coming out from the sun, and this is how far the Earth is from the sun, and this is what the Earth's orbit looks like. But that's not going to tell us how much sunlight at a given point is going to get to that grid box at time, because some of that sunlight will come straight through, but then we know there's clouds and other things that are bouncing it around. So there's going to be a series of calculations that are done in order to figure out just how much sunlight reaches that particular grid box at that time, and then based upon what the constituents of that grid box are, how much cloud there is, how much dust, we'll be able to figure out how much of that sunlight is actually going to be absorbed, and the amount that's going to be absorbed will contribute to warming the box. Okay, so that's one contribution to warming at that box. but it's definitely not the only one. In addition to sunlight, which we can see, there's also infrared radiation. Sometimes you might have seen a thermal camera infrared result. So there's energy that's going, it's invisible to our eyes, but it's being passed along in all directions at all times throughout the planet system, and there's going to be a certain amount that we're going to calculate impinges upon the box, that reaches that box, and then of that part we need to calculate based upon what the composition of that grid box is, how much is being absorbed, and the amount that's being absorbed is going to also cause warming. But there's another factor going on with infrared radiation, and that is that everything around you, right now, the desk you're sitting at or the chair, is also emitting. It's losing energy in the form of electromagnetic radiation, infrared radiations, and so we need to compute that, because that is a cooling effect for that grid box. Additional ways that you can think of an atmospheric or an ocean point warming or cooling has to do with what we would call advection. And we have 6 sides to our grid cell, and through each one of those we have a flow of air with a certain temperature. And if the air that's coming in the box is warmer than the air going out, the grid box will warm, and conversely, if the air coming in is cooler than what's going out the other sides, the whole grid box would cool at a certain rate. So we need to calculate those. Now, how do you figure out what the winds are in the model? Well, the winds, and as well as ocean currents, are going to depend a lot upon what the different pressure differentials are from one place to another. In order to compute that, you need to know the density, not just where you're at, but in the column above, everything above you, to figure out the weight of the atmosphere or the ocean above you. In order to compute that, you need to know things in the atmosphere. You would need to know the temperature. You need to know the humidity. You need to know what the pressure level you are at. In the ocean, you need to know the temperature, the salinity, and as well as the pressure level that you're at. And you have other factors such as friction or Coriolis, which has to do with the spin of the Earth, all that are going to affect the flow of winds or ocean currents. So that all that's being computed in the model. Finally, the last thing I'll mention in the atmosphere that could cause a grid cell to warm or cool has to do with latent heat, or you can think of it as a phase change. If you take a dip in the ocean or a pool and you come out and there's a breeze, you feel cool. Well, the reason that happens is because there's water evaporating from your skin, and it takes some energy to cause something to go from a liquid to a gas, to have it evaporate. So that's a cooling effect. Conversely, because we conserve energy, when you see clouds form and you go from water vapor that you can't see to a droplet, that process then releases heat that will cause the grid box to warm. So that's also being simulated in the model. So we have all these factors, take them together at that grid point. Some are causing warming, some cooling, add them up, and you can calculate the rate at which the temperature is changing in that grid cell at that time. So just for this one example I gave, we could have taken all those together. We'd get a given rate, per unit time. It's going to be changing this temperature changing in a certain way, and then we multiply that by a time step, say 10 minutes. And for this case, maybe the temperature went from 10.0 degrees centigrade to 10.05, or about up 1/10 of a degree Fahrenheit in 10 minutes. Now, those sorts of calculations are being done not just at that grid box, but all of the grid boxes. And it's not just for temperature, but a whole host of variables, and there's processes I left out. So we end up going through that, doing all those calculations, update all of them, and then we need to start all over again so we can get to 10 minutes after that. So that's what we talk about in a nutshell, in a cartoon sense, where we talk about a physics-based model marching forward in time. So you might be familiar with other types of models. They might be economic models or some other statistical models that are dealing with correlations, where you see that when this thing changes, it tends to create this amount of change in some other feature. What these models of climate get to fall back on that's a little different from just purely statistical models is we get to start with things like F equals ma, conservation of energy. So they're well grounded in physics, and that makes them a little different than some of the other models you might be familiar with. Okay, in the interest of time, I'll move past that, and here's where I hope that my internet connection and yours are up to the task. I'm going to try to show an animation here. If it's working on your end, you're going to see right now an image that you see buildings in New York City. which you might wonder what that has to do with climate. Well, now if we zoom out, it circles and shows you the size of Manhattan, and it roughly has the surface area of a 1/10 of a degree by 1/10 of a degree grid box, which happens to be the resolution that we're using spatially for one of our climate models here for the ocean. And now what you're seeing, hopefully, is a time-evolving image of sea surface temperatures that's being produced by one of GFDL's global coupled climate models. You can see the Gulf Stream heading off the U.S., and you can see eddies forming. If you focus on the Gulf of Mexico, you may see a little bit of a loop current coming up from the Yucatan over into the eastern Gulf of Mexico. And a lot of times when I show this image, people say, wow, I wonder what kind of observations are you using? Satellite information or weather balloons, or what are you using in order to force the model to produce that? And the reason I'm showing this is that the answer to that is we're not using any observations. These models that we're using to study long-term climate, as I mentioned before, we tell it where the sun is, how bright it is, we tell things about the Earth, we tell it where there's land, where there's ocean, how high the mountains are at each grid point. We tell it how deep the ocean is at each grid point. And then we just tell it what the physics of the system are. And these things that you're seeing now are being spontaneously generated by the model. There's no numbers going in here from observations forcing the tropics to be warmer than the high latitudes, or to have those waves going across the tropical Pacific that are being shown now. So, and we also need to study the full globe, even if you're just interested in what's happening in your neck of the woods, because the whole climate system is connected. So what's happening in the tropical Pacific could end up affecting what's happening over the U.S. And we're not just interested in the Gulf Stream that's around the U.S., we care about that, but we're also interested in how the Kuroshio current works off the coast of Japan that you see here, because we're moving heat, energy, momentum horizontally, vertically, through the oceans and the atmosphere, and it's that redistribution of heat energy and how much is being gained and lost in different places that's going to largely define how our climate can evolve over time. And we're going to use these models to study both the past, the present, and the future. So there's a lot of different applications for these climate results. People like me working on the physical climate side are sometimes surprised about how our model output gets used. Here's just an image to show you that what I think is one of the more unexpected applications. It turned out one of the images from one of the models we developed here, the Postal Service took and actually put on a stamp. Not, I think, necessarily because of the science, but because they like the colors. But anyway, there's a lot of ways that these climate models get used. And my picture's there just because this reminds me to tell you that, you know, this is a big and complex topic, and basically my in-laws, I think, even after being part of that family for a couple decades, this postage stamp is the part that they understand best about what I do. Anyway, we'll move on from that. We're now going to go on to the question about how we can use these models to figure out that question about whether climate change is due to humans, due to natural forces, or a combination of both. Now, we look at a number of different things that we call radiative forcing agents. These are things that cause energy flows to change in the atmosphere. There's a whole table here. The main point I wanted to make here is that we don't think just about carbon dioxide, but there's a range of forcing factors. Some of them are known with higher precision than others, and all of these different factors are included in our models. But we can also do experiments where we include some and take out others and see how the system would respond and match that up with observations of the past. The amount of carbon dioxide has been growing a lot during our lifetimes, but that's not the only feature that matters. So here's a plot where along the x-axis we have time in years, and the black line shows observed temperatures, globally averaged, at the surface of the planet over that time. And the blue arrows show that we can characterize it simply as saying that during the 20th century there was some early century warming, then kind of a period of a plateau, and then warming at the end. So can our models explain that? And the answer is, well, if we include only greenhouse gases and don't include anything else, we get something that looks like this red line, which is similar, but we don't see that plateau in the middle, and it ends up being a little warmer than what was observed. So maybe this is part of it, but perhaps it's not the whole story. So it's not only greenhouse gases that are affecting the climate, according to this model, compared to observations, but also we can then do an experiment where we say, well, let's ignore all the human changes in greenhouse gases and other things and only think about the natural variations. There have been some changes in solar output. There have been volcanic eruptions that can cause a little bit of cooling for a few years. Let's put those in and see how consistent they are. That's the red line with the black line of the observations. And up through 1960 or so, you could say, well, you know, the idea that natural forcings alone explain what happened, that was a very viable hypothesis. But over the last few decades, we can see that the observations, the black line, just aren't consistent with any model that we've been able to put together that's forced only by the natural changes. That the red line just is way too low over time. So if we can't reconcile that, then well, here's what happens when we put everything together, both the human-induced changes and the natural ones. That's the red line here compared to the black, and you can see we get a much better level of agreement. So that's very much a cartoon, quick view of what we can consider the attribution process, where we consider alternative hypotheses, look retrospectively comparing model outputs, develop different ways with what the observations show, and can kind of zoom in on and build some confidence that we understand what was causing the changes. Now here I just looked at one variable, surface air temperature. There's also looking at the ocean. We look at not just global averages, but as you can see here, it just reminds me to tell you that we look at different areas. And again, we have a consistent and compelling story between the observations and the models. And what it comes down to is kind of Goldilocks and the three bears. If we consider only the natural forcings, the climate simulation ends up being too cold at the end of the late 20th century. We can put it together different ways, and we've tried, and we just can't quite explain what was observed that way. But then again, if we only consider changes in greenhouse gases, the simulation ends up getting a little too hot too fast, and we don't see that pause in the middle of the 20th century. But we include all the different points that we have, forcing agents that we have, we get much better level of agreement. Now, I also just showed surface air temperatures, but here's an important figure that a lot of people don't appreciate. If we were to look to see where the planet has gained energy, where it's storing that energy over the last 40 years or so, you might be surprised that more than 90% of the heat that's been gained by the planet has gone into warming the ocean. You know, we tend to think mostly as climate as the near surface land or air temperature. That's what, when we're walking around, we're feeling. But the ocean, it's big, it's deep, and it has a high heat capacity, and it moves vertically. So as the surface waters warm, they tend to warm more slowly. They have a high heat capacity, and then they move farther away from the surface. And so that's where a lot of the heat has been gained. Now, there are uncertainties in these climate model projections. They're models. That means they're simplifications. That means they're not perfect. I'll just identify here there's three broad types of uncertainty when we talk about climate projections into the decades into the future. The first broad category has to do with what the future emissions of greenhouse gases will be. That isn't really a question of physics. That's a question of what people will do. But it's important for our climate models because we can consider those are the climate model inputs. Those are the things that drive our global climate models, and they depend upon human choices. The second category of uncertainty is how the climate system will respond to changes in those forcing agents, including greenhouse gases, and that's the role of the climate models. You can think of them as they just translate those changes in emissions or changes in the atmospheric composition into three-dimensional simulations of how the climate system will respond. And then what a lot of people are interested in is not how the temperature will change or how precipitation will change or just how an ocean current will change. They're more interested in how those changes in the physical climate system will affect things that they care about, whether it's crop or the spread of viruses or what it means for polar bears or coastal erosion or a whole bunch of things. Those are climate change impacts. So the output of our climate models becomes the input of analyses done by other people in order to make estimations about potential climate change impacts. So that's kind of where the things stand. One thing I'll just point out here is as a consumer of information, and we all are consumers of information that we get through the media and other sources. I just want to draw the difference between what one can call the fermenting froth versus scientific consensus. You know, science by press release isn't necessarily the best way to do science, and so we often hear about, oh, new study out shows this, or new study out shows that, but the kind of things that I presented here today in this talk are ones that are viewed as being solid. They've gone through not just peer review of individual scientific papers, but they're consistent where if after a while we look back every few years and look at not just an individual paper, but look at a host of work that's been done as follow-up, and we look to see what stands up and what doesn't stand up over time, and then we take that and we seek to communicate it to people so they can make better informed decisions. So I'll end with just returning to my 3 bullet points, where if someone wanted to ask, well then, given where the state of knowledge is and there are uncertainties, what could be done to help advance our efforts in order to allow for better informed decision making? One thing that we can think of is that I believe there's a need for improvements in cross-disciplinary communications. Climate scientists just talking among themselves isn't good enough. We need to communicate information to the public or other fields of science and social and physical sciences, the people who are interested, and that's not always the easiest thing to do. But we could also improve our climate model projections. That's a combination I've mentioned before about the hardware, the computer hardware. As we get higher performing computers, we can do more. But there's also what we sometimes could refer to as a brainware. We just need, you know, bright people involved doing well-posed scientific experiments, questioning assumptions constantly, going back and seeing what stands up and what does not. And we also need to just invest in what we can call foundational science. There's some still remaining topics that are of interest and relevant to how climate will play out in the coming decades that are going to take a while to figure out. And we'll still be asking climate questions 10 or 20 years from now, so we need to continue to support those efforts to get down to some of the basics. And with that, I will thank you for your attention, and we can see if there's a way where, if you're interested, I can answer some questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Keith. That was really interesting. I appreciate that. If you're attending the webinar and you do have a question, you can either, there should be a hand-raising functionality in your control panel. You can hit that, or you can type your question or the beginnings of it into the chat, and I can try to unmute you so you can ask Keith in person. Let's see. So there is a question. There we go. All right. Yeah, a bunch of questions. So what we'll do is just go by the order listed here. I will try to unmute you so you can speak. We will see if that works. And so the first question is from Diana Rashash. I apologize. I don't know if that's how to pronounce your name. And I will unmute you, and you should be able to ask the question through your phone or computer. Okay, Diana. Well, I can ask her question for you, Keith.
Okay.
Is tipping point still relevant? It used to be a term that was mentioned, but we haven't heard it used in years. So is that concept of a tipping point something we should still be thinking about?
Yes, it is. So in an odd coincidence, this morning I was a couple miles from where I am now at a conference where one of the day's topics was tipping points, and it was actually tipping points in marine ecosystems. So it is still relevant, depending upon where you get your information from. You know, if it's a scientific literature, maybe it's fallen out of favor there. So just for those who might be interested, the concept of tipping points is we can often, if we take the results of climate projections or just the way a lot of people intuitively think about climate, it tends to evolve slowly, so we can think of gradual changes occurring over time. But if we also look back in the observational record and look forward, we can see that there are some things that you have threshold behaviors, that you might go along slowly and gradually at some point, up until a point, and then you get to a point where there's kind of a, sometimes it refers to as a regime change or something, where you have a period of fairly rapid change, and that can be viewed as a as a tipping point. So it is a field that continues of active research in many realms. So for a while, one of the major tipping points that I would hear about had to do with the stability of Greenland ice and Antarctic ice, because if that was the sort of thing that after a certain point you had a big rush of melt and water going from a frozen form that's on land into the ocean, you could have a nonlinear effect. You would have a more rapid increase in sea level. There's also a lot of tipping points interest, like at the meeting I was at earlier today, where one is thinking about adaptation capabilities of natural or managed systems. So if you have, say, fish stocks in a given area, they may be well adapted to current temperatures or current ocean conditions, pH, etc., and they have a certain resiliency up to a point, and they can adapt at a certain pace, but you may eventually get to a point where you just cross the threshold, and then you notice a sudden change in the ecosystem. So anyway, it still is an active bit of concern, and in some of the subfields, things that had been identified as potential tipping points, I believe additional research has been done and said, okay, that system may not be so sensitive that we're close to a tipping point now, but in other fields, I believe additional potential tipping points are being identified, and research continues in all of them.
Great, thank you. Next question is just a quick one. David Liebel wanted to know if this presentation is going to be archived. I believe we're recording it. GoToWebinar says we're recording it, and so if so, we will put it up on YouTube, I think. I'll send out the link to those who are interested. And next, Stephen Pennings has a question. Stephen Pennings, excuse me. I will try to unmute you, and so you can ask away.
Hey, this is Steve Pennings. I wonder if you could comment on the various factors forcing sea level rise as opposed to temperature changes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so for broadly speaking, we can think of, if we're interested in global, excuse me?
Hello.
If we're interested in global sea level rise, you could think of there is a thermal expansion response. As oceans get warmer, the water expands. So for a given mass of water in the oceans, as it expands, the only place it can really go is up, and that can be one contributor to sea level rise. That is probably the contributor that the physical science community has the best handle on, or the narrowest range of uncertainty. Another factor is what I alluded to before, which is water that is now locked up on land in the form of ice. If that melts and finds its way into the ocean, that will also contribute to sea level rise. And that's where the stability and the melt rates of what is occurring both over Greenland and Antarctica are the areas of most concerns. Glaciers, and there's other contributors as well. So if one talks globally, those would be the two primary factors. Now, if you're going to be interested in regional changes, we could think of there being at least two other local contributors. As ocean circulation changes, it can cause water to pile up on one side versus the other. If some of the large ocean gyres spin up or spin down, that will cause redistributions of water, so sea levels could rise more rapidly than the global average in some places. They would then not rise as rapidly in others due to that redistribution. And lastly, there can just be local effects because of subsidence or raising of the land relative to the ocean, going on either through natural tectonic motions, or there can also be human-induced effects. If you pump out a lot of water or natural gas or something from an area, that could cause subsidence as well. So I think those are the four major factors. There's some of them that are acting at the global level, some at the more regional or local level, and some of them have more narrow ranges of uncertainties than others.
Does that answer your question, Steve? Sorry, I had to mute you there for a second.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, and our next question comes from Shelley Olds. I can give one stab at the answer, and then after that, Keith, maybe you could chime in as well. But there's a real obvious answer that I have to give before you. Okay, Shelley, I have unmuted you.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you for providing the nice overview. You mentioned in the cross-disciplinary communications the importance of policy-neutral boundary organizations in this realm. Could you provide some examples of those organizations?
Okay, and that's where I'll chime in. Sea Grant is a good example of a policy-neutral boundary organization. Keith, what are some other ones that you think are particularly important in this issue?
So I'm going to limit my answer to the U.S. right now, although maybe I'll preface it by saying there are some European nations, I think, that are a little bit ahead of the U.S. in getting their act together on this. Other examples at, say, the federal level is the Department of Interior has a series of 8 entities known as regional climate science centers. So the ones that, there's one known as the South Central Climate Science Center that serves Texas, Oklahoma, and some adjoining areas. That's made of a 7-member consortium, including Texas Tech, University of Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, LSU, 2 tribal nations, and actually the institution that I'm affiliated with. But there's a total of 8 of those around the U.S. NOAA also has a series of entities known as RISAs, R-I-S-A, Regional Integrated,
Science and Assessment, I think.
There you go, Science and Assessment. It's a tough one for me to remember. We spend so much time with acronyms. And they also are a boundary organization that has a certain mission to translate and transfer information from the realm of science into help meet stakeholder needs. And more recently, although I'm not sure they're really fully functional yet, is the U.S. Department of Agriculture has aimed to set up a series of what they refer to as climate hubs to serve some of the agricultural questions, where they're not going to be doing additional research of their own necessarily, but they're looking to plug in and aid, say through ag extension agents in much the same way that Sea Grant can get out and be a viable way to help convey information across the different disciplines.
Thank you very much.
Oh, and I should just mention there are a more patchwork ability where some states may have ways of doing this, and certainly it's something that private sector entities can also be involved in sort of climate consulting roles. So it's not limited only to the federal government.
Great, thank you so much. And are there any other questions? If so, either do the hand raise or chime in on the question box down at the bottom of your control panel. And it looks like there are no more questions. Again, Keith, I really appreciate you coming on. This has been very informative, and we appreciate everybody who has attended. And I will send out an email with a link to the video once it is uploaded, assuming that it recorded. I'm paranoid about that kind of stuff. And we hope that you'll join our next Texas Sea Grant Climate Literacy webinar, which will be probably next month. I'll send out an email with that information. And so thank you to Keith Dixon of NOAA's Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory, and thank you to you for attending.